Bon dia, buenos días, good morning, bonjour, egunon. Welcome everyone to Barcelona, and everyone welcome to this meeting that I hope that will be very useful in order to increase our knowledge and increase our background about different examples of periods in which the reconstruction of the fractured relationships by violence are removed. The peace-building processes in the situations of violence in Colombia, in Central America, in some situations in the Basque Country are one important topic for the ICIP until now. ICIP, International Catalan Institute for Peace, that is a public organization but independent too organization. I carry on in Spanish to respect the real English speakers, but my English level is not good. Recuerdo que las lenguas de trabajo serán el castellano y el inglés, para facilitar que haya una traducción simultánea, una única traducción simultánea. Por tanto, todos podremos expresarnos, por favor, en inglés o en castellano. Cataluña ha sido tradicionalmente tierra de acogida. Precisamente por eso, y por la tradición pactista puesta de relieve ya en el siglo XII por las asambleas de Pau y Treva, las asambleas de paz y tregua en los fines de semana, que eran muy largos, o por el consulado de mar a partir del siglo XIII, que regía las relaciones marítimas, comerciales y los derechos y deberes de cada actor en el Mediterráneo. Precisamente por eso tiene una larga tradición de ejemplos de mediación en conflictos violentos, de facilitación en procesos de paz y de organización de eventos que han servido después para hacer peace building o peacekeeping. Tiene también una tradición de teóricos sobre defensa civil, de movimientos cívicos no violentos, y eso nos enorgullece y por eso les damos doblemente la bienvenida. No obstante, la consideración de Cataluña como nación soberana ha impedido a menudo que este reconocimiento sea realmente un reconocimiento de unos valores que deben ser universales, los valores de construcción de la paz. Hoy me van a permitir que al iniciar esta jornada de reflexión sobre procesos de reconstrucción y de reconciliación post-conflicto, quiero señalar tres cuestiones que probablemente no van a ser discutidas durante el día, porque una parte sustancial de la población de Cataluña y el Estado español están en un conflicto que es de nivel político. Y las tres consideraciones que quisiera hacer sobre el particular, sin querer incomodar a nadie, es que la primera de ellas es que estamos viviendo un conflicto político que es de una parte sustancial de nuestra sociedad catalana y del Estado español. Un conflicto que está sustentado sobre la base, para unos, del reconocimiento legítimo de que Cataluña sea una nación histórica y para otros de la indisoluble unidad de España, que no considera a Cataluña como sujeto político. La segunda consideración, de las tres que haré, es que este conflicto político solamente puede tener solución cuando se aborde en un concepto de democracia de forma multilateral y cuando cada actor se vea reconocido y cuando todos los relatos oficiales y oficiosos estén sobre la mesa sin imposición de ningún relato sobre otro. Y la tercera cuestión sobre el conflicto es que hasta ahora el proceso para exigir el derecho a decidir en Cataluña se ha llevado a cabo de forma pacífica y no violenta, a pesar de muchos intentos desestabilizadores que se están dando para legitimar una respuesta represiva a un conflicto que tiene una raíz política. Sé que esta mención y que este asunto no va a estar en la agenda de hoy, que el evento está coorganizado por una fundación que no tiene por qué compartir los puntos que acabo de nombrar en este análisis. Pero una institución pública de paz en Cataluña, como es el ICIP, no puede inhibirse ante un asunto que puede minar a medio plazo la democracia en el Estado español. Y eso es realmente lo que nos preocupa, que haya un relato que diga que el problema de Cataluña es el nacionalismo, cuando la mayoría de la sociedad sabe que de las banderas y de los himnos no se come y que además no son la clave del futuro. Por tanto, no es un problema de nacionalismo. Y estamos preocupados porque afecte a medio plazo la calidad democrática y afecte algunos derechos sociales y políticos de la ciudadanía. Eso es lo que nos preocupa. Sabemos que no está en la agenda de hoy, pero sabemos también que detrás de muchos de los conflictos y de procesos de reconstrucción y de reconciliación que vamos a hablar hoy, hay detrás o en el sustrato hay problemas políticos que no están resueltos, que no se resuelven y que quedan tapados pero nunca resueltos. Por tanto, dicho esto, deseo que tengamos un intercambio muy fructífero y doy las gracias también a la Fundación Adenauer por coorganizar este acto con nosotros. Muchas gracias.
Muy buenos días. Good morning, everybody. Como veo que la mayoría de los participantes está prescindiendo de la traducción, voy a tratar de hablar en español. Para nosotros de la Fundación Adenauer es un gran placer haber podido organizar este evento junto con el Instituto Internacional Catalán para la Paz, o de la Paz. Después de un intento el año pasado, afortunadamente ahora ha sido posible organizar ese encuentro sobre experiencias de reconciliación. Y estamos muy contentos que tenemos representantes de diferentes países y continentes que nos van a relatar las experiencias de reconciliación en sus respectivos países. Nosotros, como trabajamos internacionalmente con muchas oficinas y en muchos países, siempre partimos de un supuesto que el desarrollo de un país depende mucho de la capacidad de reconciliar, digamos, las diferentes fuerzas o campos después de conflictos. Hemos presenciado durante las últimas décadas procesos de transformación y transición política en varias regiones. España y Portugal siempre son referenciados como ejemplos de una transición pacífica después de un régimen autoritario, aunque podemos también percibir que en España no todos los conflictos ya son resolvidos. Solamente hace pocos días otro conflicto en otra región sobre la cual vamos a hablar más tarde. Claro que el conflicto no fue resolvido, pero había un proceso, unas decisiones de un grupo armado de dejar, digamos, esa vía de conflicto para integrarse tal vez en otros procesos más pacíficos. Quiere decir, procesos de reconciliación son muy importantes para procesos políticos, para el fortalecimiento de la democracia. Me alegro mucho poder saludar a la señora Zelaya de Guatemala, porque nosotros, la Fundación Adenauer, trabajamos hace, no sé exactamente, 70 años o algo así en el país, uno de los primeros países donde comenzamos nuestro trabajo, y sabemos de las grandes dificultades que Guatemala hasta hoy en día está enfrentando, y sabemos también que la señora Zelaya participó muy activamente en las negociaciones hace ya algunas décadas y que todavía el país está luchando para tener, digamos, los resultados concretos en esos conflictos. Yo estuve hace pocas semanas, hace 4 semanas, estuve de viaje en Santiago de Chile. Yo he trabajado en Santiago hace ya 25 años, o 30 años ya, durante la época de la transición. Yo fui a un relativamente nuevo museo que todavía no conocí porque hace un par de años no estuve en Santiago. Es el Museo de la Memoria y de los Derechos Humanos. Una instalación muy interesante, un museo moderno, que tiene el objetivo de recordar los atropellos a los derechos humanos durante el régimen militar y que expone objetos que fueron generados durante el proceso de la transición y sobre todo en favor, digamos, de una supuesta o de una reconciliación. Tal vez ustedes saben que en aquella época de la transición el primer gobierno democrático post-pinochetismo comenzó con una comisión de verdad y reconciliación. Eso era uno de los primeros esfuerzos en América Latina, si no me recuerdo mal, para relatar, digamos, para juntar, coleccionar, digamos, las experiencias y los casos de atropellos a los derechos humanos, sobre todo las personas que fueron matadas por la dictadura, las personas que desaparecieron y que fueron torturados, etc. Y después de algunos años, esa Comisión de Verdad y Reconciliación presentó unos tomos, unos libros, donde todos los casos fueron notados, digamos, y publicados. Y eso era un primer intento de reconciliación. Yo recuerdo muy bien, porque en aquella época yo estuve no solamente en Santiago de Chile, sino también nosotros colaboramos mucho con algunos actores políticos en esa área. Y yo sé que había el intento y se logró que esa comisión fue compuesta por personajes de los diferentes campos políticos, porque sin eso no habría sido posible organizar, digamos, las entrevistas con las víctimas o con los familiares de las víctimas y todo eso. Es decir, también habían algunos personajes notados o conocidos que anteriormente habían apoyado al régimen militar, pero después se integraron en esa comisión. La comisión publicó ese informe, todo el país quedó muy impactado. Yo recuerdo muy bien esos días cuando el informe fue publicado, el país quedó muy impactado, todos sentían una cierta culpa o también una cierta, ¿cómo se llama? Scham, como ashamed, vergüenza, sí. Por todos porque mucha gente decía, como siempre acontece en esos casos, lo conocemos desde Alemania, no sabía que el régimen era tan malo, eso siempre acontece. Sin embargo, ahora cuando estuve en Santiago, pude observar, hablando con algunos amigos, algunas otras personas, que las fronteras o las barreras entre los diferentes grupos siguen presentes todavía. También 30 años después de la dictadura militar, 30 años después de la publicación de ese informe sobre verdad y reconciliación, yo hablé con alguna gente que me dijo que no van al museo porque el museo es solamente para mostrar, digamos, los atropellos y que seguían, digamos, defendiendo los llamados o supuestos logros del régimen militar, y otros, claro, que todavía están en el lado opuesto y no quieren hablar con la derecha pinochetista, etc. Eso me muestra qué difícil es encontrar caminos de reconciliación también en un contexto democrático, porque Chile hoy en día está siempre mencionado como, digamos, una de las democracias más estables de América Latina, que ha logrado mucho, por lo menos en el ámbito económico. Pero yo pude observar ahora que 30 años después, digamos, las líneas de separación siguen muy presentes en la sociedad, ¿ya? Y que todavía hay grandes problemas para que la gente realmente pueda ir uno hacia el otro y darse la mano realmente. Solamente en paréntesis, eso me recuerda a otro país, donde también parece que es muy difícil, aún 40 años después, de ir y darse la mano y trabajar sobre la memoria. Nosotros en Alemania sabemos que es muy importante trabajar la memoria para ver si se puede llegar a algunas conclusiones. No es para defender la memoria, o defender el pasado, no es para defender lo que ha acontecido, sino yo creo que un país se puede construir solamente en base del pasado. Entonces, si las fuerzas políticas y sociales quieren construir algo en común, necesitan trabajar sobre la historia y llegar tal vez a algunas conclusiones, es decir, ok, ¿cómo vamos a salir de esa situación para construir algo en común? Yo creo que eso es uno de los grandes retos y desafíos de los procesos de reconciliación, retos que son presentes en todos los países. En Alemania todavía tenemos también los retos, por eso estoy muy contento que tenemos un representante también desde Alemania que va a narrar un poco, contar lo que estamos haciendo nosotros, pero sabemos que también esos retos están enfrentando otros países, cada uno con propias experiencias, con resultados propios, y la idea justamente de este seminario es intercambiar experiencias y tal vez sacar algunas conclusiones comunes que a los que están presentes y que trabajan en estos procesos de reconciliación, que trabajan en institutos parecidos al Instituto Catalán, pueden sacar algunos provechos y resultados que les sirven. Para nosotros es un momento de agradecimiento por la iniciativa del ICIP de organizar ese evento y la posibilidad de colaborar con ustedes. Y yo estoy seguro que vamos a tener un intercambio muy interesante de experiencias y tal vez en algunos casos hasta también impactantes. Gracias.
Bon dia a tothom, buenos días. Me han invitado para ser el moderador de la sesión del día de hoy y creo que lo voy a hacer en inglés porque la mayoría de las personas invitadas les resulta más fácil ese idioma. So I've been asked to facilitate the conversations today. First of all, just a quick note to inform that one of the participants, Asanga from Sri Lanka, has unfortunately not been able to make it, so we are missing one of the guests. The other one is to introduce Farid Benavides. Say hello, please. Farid is a professor of international relations at the Blanquerna University in Barcelona, Colombian from origin, and his areas of expertise are related to justice. And he will be taking notes because he has been tasked to do the conclusions at the end of the session today. Regarding the session in itself, just a quick note, reconciliation, a word, a term everybody uses, but we all probably find very difficult to define. Why is that? Because it is probably extremely context specific, and that leads us to the session today. There's no recipe in how you do reconciliation. There's no handbook, or there are handbooks, but they're probably not very useful on how do you do reconciliation. So we thought that the session today is therefore not a session where guests will enlighten us with reconciliation, but instead we have framed this session as a learning exercise. a learning exercise for everybody else sitting in the room, but also for the guest speakers themselves, who are experts on reconciliation, but still probably have more questions than answers. Why is reconciliation important? And then how do we do reconciliation? Who does reconciliation? And in the efforts of reconciliation, what works and what doesn't work? Or what seems to be working and what apparently are the remaining challenges? Those, summing up, are probably the key questions that will be guiding our session today. We have divided the session in 3 blocks. First of all, we'll have an introduction. Brandon Hamber will be the keynote speaker. He will give us an overall conceptual introduction to the sessions, which will then be enlightened by the specific experiences from 10 different conflict-affected contexts in the world of the people, our guest speakers. But we are also inviting everybody else sitting in the room to actively participate in our conversation. This will therefore be a free-flowing session. In block number 1, each of the international guests will introduce very briefly, 5 to 7 minutes, not so much the background to the context, because they will not have time to it, just frame it very briefly and highlight 2 issues, some of the achievements, some of the remaining challenges, and therefore questions for us to consider in block number 2 and in block number 3. And I think that without any further introduction, I will hand the floor over to Brandon.
Okay, well, thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me and giving me the opportunity to do the keynote address. I'm well aware that probably any one of the invited guests could be giving the keynote address this morning, so it's my privilege to be asked and to be in this great space. I also feel slightly guilty about giving the keynote address because you all have such a short amount of time and I got 30 minutes, so I'm feeling a little bit guilty, which doesn't mean I'm not going to use my 30 minutes, but I think I will at least try and use it as productively as I can. Where is the little thing here? Okay, well, as I said, thank you very much. What I'm going to try and do this morning is just give a basic introduction, really, to some of the ideas around reconciliation, perhaps suggest a few points or axes of discussion that we might have, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about the Northern Ireland context and how we've defined reconciliation, which, exactly as Christian pointed out, may not be contextually correct for yourselves, but hopefully will give some food for thought in relation to thinking about the concept as we go forward today. I simply entitled the talk "Reconciliation" with a question mark and put that lovely picture of a road, because I think for many of us who've worked in this field for a long time, and exactly as Christian said, there are still many, many questions. And what is the exact road to reconciliation? Should we even be using that term? Are there better words than reconciliation? I think these are still quite important questions. In terms of myself, I am originally from South Africa. I worked extensively with victims of political violence in South Africa before the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and about 15 years ago I moved to Northern Ireland and have continued some of that work there and in other societies. And I thought maybe by way of starting, I would just mention a very specific case that I worked on in South Africa, and it was of a woman who we worked with extensively. She gave testimony before the Truth Commission, and we in fact made 2 films about her story. Her son was 17 years old when he was killed. He was shot, and all the evidence pointed to the fact that it was the South African police that killed her son. He had been in and out of detention, he'd been tortured. He, in fact, in the 1980s was a very famous young man because he was featured on a CBS documentary in the United States talking about children who were being tortured. And through the process of the Truth Commission, I one day got a phone call from one of the investigators saying, through our process, we've discovered who killed her son. So we were very happy about this fact, that this truth had come out, and I won't go into the technicalities of how that happened. But it actually turned out that it was not the police who killed her son, but his own comrades from the liberation movement, and they had suspected, and it's never been proved, but they had suspected he was a spy, and the reason why he was going in and out of jail was because he was passing information. And this was their story. But it was an incredibly difficult time for us. It was an incredibly difficult time for her. She was very sick, and in fact, this sort of hastened her death in many ways. And it was a tragic situation, but actually the Truth Commission did what it was meant to do. It was meant to find the truth, and it found the truth. But it wasn't the truth that we wanted, and it wasn't the truth that she wanted. And for me, at a personal level, this was a very important moment, because suddenly the way I had understood everything got turned upside down, and the narratives which I had were challenged, and I would talk about it as the sort of space became a lot more grey. It wasn't so black and white, it became more grey for me. And it was, in some senses, as tragic as it was, a moment of reconciliation in a strange way, a moment of sort of realizing the complexity of the conflict. So I raised the story because the questions I want to put forward to you today is that how reconciliation is built? Is it built through individual cases, through challenging narratives, through difficult dialogues, through hearing the stories that we don't want to hear or that challenge the way that we think? Or, and I was interested in what Xavier said in the beginning, is it a political process? Is it something which is more political in nature? And we're trying to manage these complex political transitions. And so how do these individual processes and how do these political processes relate to each other when we think about reconciliation? And those are really the questions I want to start with. And when I talk about our definition of reconciliation, I'm going to try and show how we've tried to balance those things, which may or may not be right, but it's how we have started to work with that. Before I do that, I thought I would just make a few broad introductory comments. And Christian started with this. In a sense, you can find definitions of reconciliation, but actually it's quite hard to find a global definition. And maybe there's an argument to say there shouldn't be a global definition. It depends on each context. It's going to be quite different. People are going to interpret it in different ideas. Having said that, at a most basic level, for many people it seems to loosely imply some sort of accommodation, some sort of coming together, some sort of building of relationships. This, of course, is very challenging, and many of you know this in the room, because the word itself has all sorts of different connections and meanings in different contexts. In Northern Ireland, you can't mention the word reconciliation without it sounding like you are talking about theology or the church, because it is attached primarily to that meaning. Interestingly, if you put reconciliation into Google, you will get lots of things about accountancy, about reconciling numbers and accounts, so it means something different in another context. And then, like the story I told you, I think reconciliation has also become quite mixed in with the ideas of truth commissions, of work on narratives, on issues of forgiveness. And for me, there are questions about whether the term should be associated with that. And hopefully, over the course of today, we will discuss that. I think in terms of the introduction I gave and the issue of is it individual, is it political, I think we can often think of what are the societal processes for reconciliation? What do societies need to do? What does the body politic, need to do in relation to reconciliation? And what do individuals need to do? How do they address some of their own suffering and pain? And even for those who may not be directly affected, how they understand the narratives of the past. So it's a little bit of what I said in the introduction, the tension between the societal and the individual, and hopefully we will talk about that today. But there is also a process in which sometimes the societal and political processes might influence the individual. So if I think of Northern Ireland, when Martin McGuinness, who was linked with the IRA and Deputy First Minister, when he went and shook hands with the British Queen, he created a context in which for some individuals, perhaps thinking about connecting with other people was important. So the societal affected the individual. But that same act, for some other victims, they felt it was a betrayal. And in fact, it potentially undermined their potential of connecting with other people. So we not only have individual processes and societal processes, the societal and the individual and the interpersonal processes are connected. So maybe we'll talk a little bit about that today. The final sort of axis I wanted to talk about is, and many of you who work in this field would have heard this, is between what we might think of as thin ideas of reconciliation and thick ideas of reconciliation. So I think some people, when they say reconciliation, they're meaning a fundamental transformation of relationships, of how people connect with each other, how the societal culture might change. And other people mean something a lot more thin, a lot more simple. It's people living in coexistence. You walk down one side of the street, I walk down another side of the street, we live in harmony, but we don't really mix with each other. And there seems to be a tension in the literature, in the work that people do, between this idea of coexistence and this idea of maybe a deeper form of reconciliation. And I'm going to come back to that when I talk about the Northern Ireland case. But there are real tensions, I think, in terms of that. And also that at different points in time, maybe that's different. Maybe immediately after a conflict, all best we can think about is we stop killing each other and you walk down the street and I walk down the street. But maybe later on, we're thinking about a more fundamental social process. So by way of introduction, I just wanted to throw out some of those points as hopefully shaping a little bit of what it is that we're going to talk about today. I now just want to talk a little bit about how we have tried to deal with the issue of reconciliation in the Northern Ireland context. And I'm completely aware that this may have no relevance to any of you. It may be quite different, but I think it might be a useful springboard, at least, for some of the discussion. And by way of introducing that, I need to acknowledge my colleague, Gráinne Kelly, who's not here, but Gráinne Kelly and I have worked on this together. So it's not just my work. We've worked on this work together over many different years, a number of years. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how we think about reconciliation. Then I'm going to relate it to South Africa and Northern Ireland, and I will end there. What we found way back in 2005, the European Union had been putting enormous amounts of resources into Northern Ireland, which for many of you in other contexts, it may sound quite astounding, but they had put in some 2 billion euro into the peace process in Northern Ireland. And this was all framed under this idea of building peace and reconciliation. But nowhere could we actually find what they meant by reconciliation. And again, like the idea of coexistence or transformation, there was this broad idea of what one could think about as peace by prosperity, relationship building by building the economy, seemed to be this sort of hidden thing that they were saying. If we could uplift the society, if people had more jobs, this would transform relationships. But this was a theory, but nowhere could we find this definition. So we decided to do this piece of research, and we went to local communities and we started to say to them, how would you define reconciliation? And the challenge we had was many people were like, oh, I'm not so sure. So Gráinne and I went off and we decided to build what we called a working definition of reconciliation. And we took it back to the communities and then sort of debated this with them. So what I'm going to present to you today is this working definition. But before we got there, we had to think, where does reconciliation fit in this peace-building agenda? How does it relate to peace-building? So this is what we came up with, and you don't have to believe this, but this is what we came up with. We said that reconciliation was the relationship-building component of peace-building. So peace-building has other dimensions. It has building the economy. It has building institutions. It has a range of different processes, these wider processes that you would need to build peace within a society. And reconciliation is the component which deals with the relationship aspect of that, recognizing that for societies in conflict, that actually relationships would have been damaged. At the same time, we recognized that the word reconciliation maybe wasn't the best word for this, because actually in the societies we were working in, we weren't reconciling, Actually, people had never had a relationship with each other in the first place. So you were actually building a relationship. You weren't reconciling a relationship. But we decided we would stick with this word. The other challenge we had is that actually when we started to think about it, every aspect of peace building had a relationship component. So in Northern Ireland, if you're going to build a road, it's not just building a road, because the moment you start the consultation about building the road, the question is, which community is benefiting from building this road? Is it this community or this community? And then you're into the debate and the fight about who's benefiting. And so what seems like a technical part of rebuilding the economy becomes a relationship question. So relationships are the part, reconciliation is the relationship part of peace building, but it's also part of all aspects of peace building. And so for us, we also tried to move away from thinking about reconciliation as people shaking hands and coming together, but rather the idea of the process of how we address these fractured and conflictual relationships, and also that you couldn't impose this on people. You couldn't say you have to do this. So it's a sort of voluntary act, which at a political level makes things a little bit more complicated. So, in terms of our working definition, and as I said, you don't have to buy into this, this is what made sense for us. And over the last 10 years or more, we've tested this at different moments, and we've just gone through another round of meeting a range of political players in Northern Ireland, discussing with them this model again, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. But basically, we came up with this sort of relatively simple idea that reconciliation had 5 connected strands. So the first of those is that it has to be about the future. It has to be a process, if we're thinking of rebuilding relationships, where people are what we call developing some sense of a shared common vision. That doesn't mean that they have to have the same political vision. So in Northern Ireland, that they all agree whether Northern Ireland is part of the United Kingdom or part of the Republic of Ireland, but that they have to have some reason as to why they want to rebuild a relationship. We don't want our children to suffer. We want a more peaceful society. We want things to be different. We want it to be more prosperous. Whatever it is, you only would commit to rebuilding relationships if you have some shared idea why you want to do that into the future. So the first strand is about looking forward. At the same time, we recognize that in Northern Ireland and other places, that people have hurt each other. They've been damaged, there's been relationships damaged, there's been violence, all sorts of human rights violations. So the second part of our definition says we also have to look backwards at the same time. So how do we deal with the past? Is it a truth commission? Is it a storytelling process? Is it community-based work? But there's something about it that has to be backward-looking and has to address the blame, the hurt, acknowledge the damage that has taken place. So there's something about this rebuilding of relationships that has to look backwards. The third dimension is that we actively have to build relationships. So we actually have to very actively connect people, and they have to build relationships with one another. And I'll talk about this a little bit in a few minutes when I refer to South Africa. At a time when the European Union was putting a lot of money into the peace process in Northern Ireland, and in fact, it partly led to this definition, I gave a speech in which I said, and I don't know if this will translate for those of you listening to the translation, it seems that the view is that as long as there are bums on seats, good things are happening. And what I meant by that is that in every workshop you did, you had to fill in a form saying how many Catholics and how many Protestants were in the room. So there was this sort of assumption that as long as you put these different people together, this was a good thing. And we had to count how many people, and nobody really said what's actually happening. You know, maybe people were in the room, and that's why they then had their suspicions of one another completely confirmed, and actually it made things more negative rather than positive. So we have to actively put people in the room, but in the fourth dimension, we actually have to encourage attitudinal and cultural change. So it can't just be about bringing people together. There have to be active strategies of trying to change, whether that's through narrative, dialogue, hearing stories, connecting, being in spaces with one another. So the fourth dimension is not just the relationship building at the third, but actively changing that. And then the fifth and final dimension is that we can't expect to build relationships with people if we're politically and economically unequal. How can I ask someone to build a relationship if they're living in the gutter and I'm living in a mansion? and we say we want to build relationships. So there's an equality and an equity, and sometimes that's economic, but sometimes that's political. People have to feel they have a political space. So these were the 5 dimensions that we started to think about. And I will make 3 additional points in relation to that. The more we thought about that, however, is that we realized that actually in most societies in conflict, those 5 things are in contradiction with one another. They're in tension with one another. So in Northern Ireland, we're saying to people, we want to build a common vision. We need to move forward. We need a new society. Yeah, okay, I buy into that. And in part of that process, we're going to have an early release scheme for political prisoners. So for some person on the second dimension, their sense of justice is being undermined, but we're saying we want to build a common vision at the same time. It's actually a tension. Or in South Africa, we're saying let's build relationships between people, but the 5th dimension, we recognize that people are unequal, so we need to take resources away from somebody. So you're saying, I'm going to take your resources away, and I want to build a relationship with you at the same time. So our first point was, actually, these are in tension with one another. This is not a recipe. You don't just say, we'll do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Actually, how do we recognize they contradict one another quite often? In terms of, if you think of a society like Northern Ireland and many others, I won't comment on any local contexts, but sometimes people's aspiration of what a common vision is in quite a strong contradiction to how they need to build relationships at the same time. The second point about this is that we realized that for many people, reconciliation was very ideological. And I use ideological with what we would say in Northern Ireland with a small I. So not big ideology, but small ideology. And I have a colleague in South Africa called Hugo van der Merwe. And about the Truth Commission, he always used to say, there seemed to be 2 different ways that people thought we needed to build peace in South Africa. The one was people who thought people needed to feel the heat. And what he meant by that is legal and human rights lawyers felt that if people were going to rebuild relationships, there had to be a breaking of impunity. People had to be prosecuted. The truth had to come out about the past. So we had to build this new framework for how people would think about the future. And then there were other people who thought to build peace, we needed to see the light. Embodied by Archbishop Desmond Tutu, we needed to see the light. We needed to realize everyone was human, and you're as human as me, and I will understand you. And so there were these sort of competing ideas of what actually reconciliation was about. And the more I've talked about reconciliation, the more I've become convinced of this, that relationship building is fundamental to human culture. So we have to interrogate our own basic assumptions as to how we think relationships are built. And generally, some people think they're built by regulating society, and other people think they're built by connecting people at a human level. And depending on our ideology, we might do this differently. So having said all of that, as much as we have felt that reconciliation is about these 5 dimensions, more recently, we've started to think about reconciliation as the process of how you actually manage these tensions. How you manage these complex agendas of building relationships, building a political vision, dealing with the past. And actually that's your measure of reconciliation, not whether you deliver each of these in and of themselves. So you could deliver prosperity in your society, but if you haven't necessarily addressed the past, that could still be fragile in different ways. So that's where we have got to in relation to this. So I will conclude by now relating this a little bit back to South Africa and Northern Ireland so that hopefully it makes a little bit more sense. And what you will see there are 2 different images. The one on this side is an image from South Africa, and it's maybe not very clear up there, but you can see a train line running down the middle, and on the one side there are shacks, a squatter camp, and on the other side, you can maybe see it a little bit, are really nice houses with swimming pools, and so you have this disparity with the train line down the middle, and I'm going to come back to that. And on the other side, in Northern Ireland, 20 years after the peace agreement, in a context now where actually the government has now collapsed again, these are some images from Northern Ireland. So still, I drove past it the other day, this mural outside one of the communities, prepared for peace, ready for war. So in this community, there's still a sense that things have not been fully addressed. And the picture of, I know some of you have been to Northern Ireland, but the second picture there is of what's fondly referred to in Northern Ireland as a peace wall. These are walls that still divide communities. And in fact, since the peace agreement, there have been more of those walls going up than actually coming down. So despite the peace agreement, there is structural and social division. 94% of children are still schooled in either a Protestant school or a Catholic school. So despite the peace process, these social divisions exist. So what does this mean for our definition? Well, what it means is that we almost feel that in an ideal world, the two societies, South Africa and Northern Ireland, have done well on exactly the opposite dimensions of our definition. So South Africa was very good in this idea of projecting a common vision. Nelson Mandela's Rainbow Nation, that we'll build this non-racial future, very good at this language of where we are going as a society. The Truth Commission, I could talk at length with its problems, but there was a concerted attempt, dimension number 2, to deal with the past. But actually, it's on dimension 3, 4, and 5 that South Africa is the weakest. Weakest being the inequality between the communities, as you can see in that photo, so dimension 5. But also the model of reconciliation in South Africa assumed that if we got the politics right, if we got people around the boardroom, if we deracialized the economy, then somehow relationships will be built and dimensions 3 and 4 would follow from that political process. And what we know is that that's not been the case. There are still significant racial tensions within South Africa. It has not flowed in that way. So South Africa has really been, I think, quite good on dimensions 1 and 2. If I think of Northern Ireland, it's exactly the opposite. So what's happened in Northern Ireland is that there's been a substantial investment in relationship building. The €2 billion I mentioned, dozens and dozens of community projects, some brilliant work that you would see with young people, with all sorts of different groups. So significant contribution under number 3, relationship building and trying to change attitudes. The economy is problematic and it may get worse after Brexit, who knows. But relatively speaking, it's, the two communities are much closer together economically than they've ever been. But the real challenge in Northern Ireland is actually dimension 1 and 2. The politicians really struggle to talk about a common vision. Now, this might be because of the politics of what this conflict is about, but in our research, every time we've gone to people, they've said to us, the politicians are not demonstrating the leadership we need to try and manage these contradictions. So every time they're given the opportunity to say, this is how we want to shape the future, it becomes a contestation about the divisions of the past. And 20 years after the process, there is still no overarching strategy for dealing with the past. So it's my way of saying, although our definition is quite simple, we found it really helpful of sort of thinking about where do we need to put the emphasis in different contexts. How do we manage those different tensions in different ways? By way of conclusion, I wanted to just end by making a few points, and I've said most of these. The first is that certainly, and that's what prompted our definition, we feel that reconciliation is a process which is both individual, it's about connecting communities, but it is also profoundly political. And that idea of building a common vision and how politicians come together to talk about how they want to rebuild the future is integrally linked to how a society will change. In Northern Ireland, through the work of the ARC project, which is linked with the centre I work with, and a joint project between Ulster University and Queen's University, we have 20 years of data about the peace process. And what's really interesting about this data is every year they ask the same question: have relationships improved between Catholics and Protestants in the last 5 years? And what's really interesting about that is that whenever there's a significant political development, the answer to that goes up. People say, yes, they've improved. Now, actually, how could they really have improved? Between 1997 and then between 1998 when they signed the agreement, people were still living separately, but when you look at the graph, it jumps up. People saying, yes, relationships have improved. So in other words, the political and the social is influencing how people think about one another. And the community work in Northern Ireland has also shown that when we build those relationships, it improves how people think about the political process. So, what this means is that primarily for me, reconciliation is about the relationship component building, part of peace building, but it is fundamentally about managing complexity. And managing that complexity is a political task that is incredibly a difficult one to achieve. And I'm going to end with a quote from John Hume, who was the Nobel Peace Prize winner in Northern Ireland. And it's back from the 80s, and he was talking to people in the European Union. And John Hume, when he first started to talk about reconciliation, he started to talk about it in what we could think about as a very instrumental way, which was, if there was ever going to be a united Ireland on the island of Ireland, that actually the Catholic and Protestant relationships had to be improved. So he meant it very instrumentally. I want to work with you because when I get my political vision of a united Ireland, I want you to be happy with my vision. So he starts with quite an instrumental view. But I think the more he engages in politics and the more I read of his work, he starts to see reconciliation as, in fact, this relationship building process, irrespective of whatever his political vision is, whether a united Ireland happens or not. And he starts to look towards Europe and a wider context of building relationships as the core of politics, irrespective of whether I achieve my political vision or I don't achieve my political vision. So he moves away from this idea of saying it's just about people-to-people work or that it's just instrumental, to actually saying it's the heart of the serious business of politics. And I'm going to end with a quote from John Hume. So he says, "Let the reconciliation start today in this room between ourselves. Goodwill alone will not suffice. We must apply all the resources of our collective intelligence, our imagination, our generosity, and our determination to this great enterprise to be seen to do it. We must mean business, and we must be seen to desperately mean business." Thank you.
Thank you, Brandon, for this brilliant introduction. I think it's been extremely thought-provoking and very helpful for warming up the conversation we'll be having throughout the day. We'll now have some 20-25 minutes for reactions from anybody around the table or also on the chairs in the back. They can be questions to Brandon, but they can also be reflections which you want to share after hearing this keynote introduction.
To break the ice, thank you very much, very interesting. I think there are two levels, at least what I could observe over the time is, the one is the personal level. You have mentioned all these people who are attended by these peace and reconciliation commissions and who tell their stories. But the other, and you insisted also in this, is a political level. And so I think in many cases there is still a lack of a common political project. So if you have, because the conflicts were many times because of ideological differences or economic interests, but it was in many cases ideological, may it be racism, may it be political ideology, and so on and so forth. And of course, these ideas will not die after a violent conflict. These differences persist, and so I see that it is very difficult for the political leaders to overcome these differences and to reconcile their different ideological views as a necessary tool to reconcile the broader society. So I don't know how to overcome this. I do not understand it very well.
So, I mean, I don't know completely how to overcome that either myself, and I suppose the point I was trying to make about that is that I think we have to recognize that that is a key task of leadership and politics in societies that are moving out of conflict. And I think that because reconciliation is often seen as this sort of soft concept, something that is put forward by peace people, or in other contexts, say particularly in Latin America, many people will say it's just a way of not dealing with justice, of not addressing the past. We fail to sort of see its profound importance at a political level of trying to alter the nature of these relationships. So we can have many discussions about the role of Nelson Mandela in the South African process, but in his mind you can see he fully understands that the only way we're going to move the society forward is to change the language, to change how we talk about each other, to change how we think about each other. And somebody like Martin McGuinness, actually, in Northern Ireland, also completely recognizes the imperative of changing the discourse, of changing the language, of changing the frame of reference in terms of how we think about the future. So I don't really know exactly what the recipe to get there is, but I almost feel the first step is that we actually have to say, this is an important part of the process. And that's why I finished on the serious business. This is the serious business of politics. This is not the soft end of the process. This is the serious business. And there are many examples, certainly at the political level, like the Mandela, McGuinness. If you think of the difference of the way Ronald Reagan worked with Tip O'Neill in the United States, two people, Democrat and Republican, compared to what's happening today in terms of the discourse and the language, you suddenly realize actually you can change the framework of the discussion. I don't know how you do that and how it works in every context, but for me it's the first step is saying we need to do that and stop talking about reconciliation as if it's the poor cousin of the political process. It's not the best word, as I said, because it conjures up religious and other images. Maybe there's another word for this type of politics, but I think it's important.
Hi, I'm Cecile from the School for a Culture of Peace. My answer has to do maybe with my question with the current situation here in Catalonia. Sorry, I'm thinking how can you promote reconciliation when there are trends of polarization? I was attending a workshop on polarization, and they were saying, and I think we are seeing this currently in our current context, that people who try to have a intermediate position, let's say, and place themselves in the grays, they are publicly targeted as scapegoats and really harshly attacked by public opinion. And so I think reconciliation is something that in a post-war context can be something accepted. But when there is a trend towards polarization, I think reconciliation is also needed, but it's publicly brave to take a stand, and also you will receive a lot of hostility if you have this position.
I mean, I don't know, again, the specific answer to your context, but I think the observations you make are true. In the interest of time, I had left out the longer part of that quote from John Hume, but he starts by saying, and this was back in the 70s and 80s, I mean, he was a nationalist, and he was talking about reconciliation. And he starts by saying, there are people all around me who abhor the idea of reconciliation. That basically him just mentioning it was somehow suggesting that he was betraying some sort of principle. And in Northern Ireland, there are so many examples of exactly what you talk about. And it's been incredibly difficult for any political party which has tried to not be part of the dominant communities in the society to make any headway. So another way of thinking about that, I mean, you'd asked in terms of solutions. I mean, I think there are socio-political ways of thinking about that in terms of how do you foster different type of leadership, how do you intervene with different leaders where they may be able to start to push a different discourse. And certainly in Northern Ireland, we've seen civil society and certain individuals able to do that. They've affected individuals who have changed the political discourse. So there's something at that level one can do. But then there are also structural related issues. So in the Northern Ireland context, for example, the fact that the power share structure is built around this model where you actually have to designate yourself as Catholic or Protestant, which makes sense because you don't want people to, what the fear of people would be that there would be a majoritarianism in the local structure. But the very structural process of having to designate yourself has in fact entrenched those identities over time rather than broken those identities down over time. So there might be in different contexts structural political ways of also breaking some of those senses of identity. Again, if we think of Northern Ireland, and now this is going backwards today, but the ability of, and the shifts within the European Union changed how people could reshape their senses of identity because the whole idea of the borders was shifting. I'm talking about the late 1990s and into the 1990s. So at a structural level, the very existence of the EU and that both societies were part of the EU changed the framework of how certain people started to think about it. But I know that might not help your current situation, but I think there are socio-political things and then there are structural things. At a community level, I think it's also really important to acknowledge the point that you're raising. And one of the things I wanted to say, which I forgot to say, was that in our research, when we asked community workers, do they use the term reconciliation, they largely said to us, no. So we thought they would say no. And we then said to them, why? And we thought they would say, oh, it's like a religious term, or crazy South Africans have like imported this into our context, so we don't like this term. But actually what they said to us is whenever we use it, it scares people off. It scares the communities off. Because, so that was really interesting, because what it says is that actually intuitively, they don't understand reconciliation as a thin coexistence model. They understand it as fundamentally changing society. And for communities at a local level, to talk about that was an incredibly scary idea. So again, trying to think practically in terms of your question, what that meant in our context is that we had to recognize that in the beginning, some work had to happen in certain communities and not be about building bridges. So this idea of thinking about, you don't build a bridge from the middle. You have to build a bridge from two sides to somewhere meet in the middle. So we had to recognize that some of the work had to be with exclusive communities of one side or the other, with the idea that at some point they might connect with others. And that worked, and it also didn't work. So in some areas it just meant people entrenched their identities and they never moved anywhere. But in other areas it started to open the space when they felt confident enough to engage with others once they had done that individual work. So I don't know. So that's three ideas: the socio-political linking with politicians, the structural nature of peace processes, and then this idea of maybe where do you start at a community level.
First of all, thank you very much for all those points that you came up, and I can agree with many of them. I have 2 points, actually 2 questions that I want to ask you. First of all, you said that the reconciliation process not only on level of society, but also on the level of politicians, on a political level. What if the politicians are opposing it? What if they are against it? Is it possible to do reconciliation? And the second question that would be related also with your first point about creating common vision. If we are having visions, that political or visions of identity, strongly opposing, is it possible to go on creating a common vision, or we need to deal with those opposing visions, political visions, constitution visions, visions of independence of some parts of country first, and then to reach the creation of common vision? Or we can skip that part and be creative and be later up to reach some ideal vision.
Thank you. I'm happy for others to answer the questions as well in relation to their context. I mean, they're both good questions, and I think as much as we have this framework, in Northern Ireland we've had exactly these same problems. Politicians who've opposed the process, who want to continue to build identities in a narrow way rather than a wide way, so these are very familiar problems, and I don't have an easy answer to it. But I'll start with your second question first. When we talk about common vision, what we mean is not that people necessarily have the same political common vision. So not that everybody wants to be part of a united Ireland or wants to be independent or whatever the case is. It's not about answering that political question, which is what's often the very cause of the conflict in the first place. It's about thinking about what elements about the future can people share. So that might be as simple in the first instance, in Northern Ireland it was, for example, that we want to stop killing. So that's a form of a common vision, and that involves engaging with politicians, with political parties, maybe it's structural things that cause that to happen. So the common vision might simply be about we want a different future. But we don't really know exactly what that future is. So sometimes the first step is to maybe think a little bit lower in terms of what is the lowest form of common vision that we can think about and hopefully build towards the other. Now, in the Northern Ireland context, that sort of worked and that sort of hasn't worked. But our research consistently shows for 10 years that when we speak with politicians, with community workers, with other people, that they keep coming back and saying, without the leadership, without people resolving that issue, we're not going to move forward. And so they basically keep acknowledging to us the common vision is important, but nobody exactly knows what's the key to change it. So I feel convinced it's an important part of the reconciliation process, but I can't completely answer other than saying you start with the small things, how you completely unlock that, and it will be interesting to hear from when people talk about their contexts. I mean, certainly when it comes to politicians specifically, and this might be very different in other contexts where maybe the societies are much bigger, but over the years I certainly have become more convinced that individuals do make a difference at a political level, and it's the socio-political example I gave earlier, where I do think peace groups, individuals, people with an interest in the future, engaging certain politicians individually to try and change their rhetoric and their language, even marginally, is an important part of the peace process. And that's incredibly difficult. It's incredibly difficult for people working in the peace field, because sometimes it means engaging with people that you might see as a perpetrator or somebody who you fundamentally disagree with their belief of the world. But I don't think you can move the society forward unless you start to see that change in rhetoric, the change in language, and sometimes that's an individual process. And to me it's always curious that we invest so much money at a community level of trying to bring different communities together to talk to each other, but we don't think we need to invest the same amount of time at a political level. So if you think of Northern Ireland, some of the changes happened in the early 90s because they put the politicians on an aeroplane, they flew them to South Africa, they met Mandela, they spent time with each other outside of the political arena. So those sort of second level processes of just building connection with people actually was one of the reasons why that agreement came about. Then straight after the agreement, we're like, oh, it's normal politics now, everything's fine, and we stopped investing in our politicians. So we let them get on with it, and then we're surprised that 20 years later, they've gone like that, because we haven't actually invested in trying to think about how we keep people connected with one another. And I know that sounds a bit idealistic, but it's important.
So, again, it's open for you. You don't have to ask questions to him, or he's not the only one who's going to answer. So if any of you feel like you would like to answer some of Daniel's questions and the other way around, please feel free to do so.
Good morning. Thank you for your brilliant intervention. Some thoughts and questions at the same time. Jordi Palou from Letter of Peace addressed to the UN Foundation. Two different examples. One about Rwanda that I have been working for the last 17 years. And about the term, but also the concept of reconciliation. They were managing in a long process what they called inter-Rwandan dialogue that I was facilitating. And two different issues that they were addressing is, first thing, when we talk about reconciliation, it seems that there was a previous situation that was reconciled and that now is addressed to be reconciled again. And they were putting over the table that some situations and some relations between communities was not previously reconciled. So you need maybe to do a previous work of conciliation before doing a reconciliation issue or initiative. The second point is, and this is also connected to our situation in Catalonia precisely, is that when they were sharing about reconciliation between Hutu, Tutsi, and Twa, they were aware of the needs of also reconciliation inside their own communities, meaning that, for instance, there were huge differences between Rwandans in the north or in the south, or there were huge differences between the Tutsi inside the country and the descendants of the Tutsi that went out in the independence process in the 50s or the 60s. So this is something that I would like to know a little bit about your vision. The second example about our situation in Catalonia and in Spain, we've been doing some initiatives that we have called memorial audiences, inspired by the public audiences of the Truth Commissions, and try to adapt to the situation in Spain and Catalonia. Yesterday we had a memorial audience in a local lead city town in the center of Catalonia, and there were 11 witnesses, and the last two of them were two great sons, one that was killed during the first months of the Civil War, and he addressed this initiative because he knew about that from the press, which is, and he said because there was a previous recognition of the city town, of the Republican major. The history of my family is not portrayed in this initiative, and I need to address that in a public ambience. And at the same time, there was the great son of the chief of the revolutionary committee that killed his grandfather, who intervened just after that. Just all these linked with the common vision that you were saying. They were sharing their experiences, but at the same time, the great son of, let's say, of the victim ended his statement saying, we need to rethink our investment of war as a society. It's not possible that today we invest so much money in all these enterprises and all that. So it was a peace statement after his personal experience, which in fact was coincidental with the great son of, let's say, the perpetrator, who was and is a pacifist himself, and did, let's say, a very similar statement at the end, portraying also himself as one of the actors that was very active in the current, let's say, political situation and conflict, and he received aggression from the police on the 1st October referendum and all that. So just putting over the table how these also common visions which are not related, let's say, with their own experience and their concrete issue about the past, but emerge a common vision spontaneously about needs of a political change or economical change about war. Thank you very much.
Before you answer, maybe we'll take one or two more points and then ask Brandon to wrap up, and we go for a coffee break. If anyone else wants to say something, Farid.
Yes, thank you for the presentation. I have a question that, because the way you were presenting it is mostly about political communities, and political groups, and it's like the big picture. So how big groups reconcile themselves. So you were not talking about individuals reconciling themselves. And one question that I have is, what do we do in terms of radical evil? When you have people, for example, like in Germany, Nazi perpetrators, and you have people that were, for example, in a concentration camp, and you're asking these people to reconcile, when for them it's impossible to recognize the other as a legitimate actor in the process of reconciliation. Because it seems to me that the way you are presenting it is more after a war or a conflict when you don't have radical evil in the middle of the picture. So that is my question.
Thank you. So I'm hoping everyone will help answer these later on. I don't know if I know the answers to every single question. I mean, I think in terms of some of your thoughts that you raised, I mean, yes, I think as I mentioned, when we talk about reconciliation, we talk about it as rebuilding and building relationships, because actually most of the societies, people, as you say, were not conciled before, so it's become a wider term, and that's why I sometimes don't like the term, but it's become something that we would use. I think the second point you raise about inside communities is really, really important. And in terms of certainly the research I have done in South Africa, Northern Ireland and other places, actually in almost every context, when you start to speak to people about relationships, their first comment is about their own communities before they start talking about the other. And so one has to be really careful about how one frames the problem. And if I think of the Northern Ireland context, one of the challenges of the funds which were made available for the peace program was it made this assumption that there were these two communities that existed and that we could invest in these two communities to change their relationships. So there was a set of assumptions about what that looked like. But actually inside those communities, there were so many different levels of division, and in fact, that's where the reconciliation is built, when you start to recognize the complex nature of your societies. So it's not exactly what I meant when I talked about building the bridge from both sides, but you do have to invest in different communities in different types of ways. And I suppose what I would say in terms of the your memorial audiences is that for common vision, and it links to some of the political points, for a common vision to start to develop, you have to open the public spaces in which people can talk about these things. And of course, if we're talking about repressive societies and societies where that's been closed down, that's an incredibly difficult thing. And to some level, that's the very challenge. And so I think our colleague over there is right. I mean, my comments were framed very much in societies which are sort of moving out of a conflict, not societies which are maybe in the middle of a conflict. It seems quite strange that you would start to say, let's rebuild relationships when there's an active war that's going on, and the dynamics of maybe ending the war are slightly different to the process of trying to rebuild or build relationships. So, but you have to find a way to open that space. And sometimes societies are lucky enough, they have politicians who can open that space. In South Africa, very briefly, we could open that space at the sort of Truth Commission level. Sometimes communities themselves have to open that space through community processes, or the REMI project in Guatemala. People have to create that space themselves. Other people can't, they don't always give you that space. So I think that's important. I think at a formal level, that links to, at a political level, the idea of acknowledgement. And maybe we can talk a little bit more about that. What does acknowledgement actually mean? And similar to the idea that we can very easily make assumptions that our societies are 1 community, 2 communities, 3 communities, or 4 communities, it's important to recognize that to start to open those spaces, you sometimes need to acknowledge things which are much wider than, say, for example, just human rights violations. And that's one of the challenges, say, in the South African context, was that we did have that open space, but then we tended to open that space and frame it around direct human rights violations, not around structural injustices, social justice, poverty, racialized poverty, gender racialized poverty. So sometimes those acknowledgements have to also be much wider than, I think the transitional justice field doesn't help us sometimes, because it tends to think of reconciliation as about human rights violations, not about these wider sets of social relationships. In terms of your radical evil, I don't think that for me, well, I know for me, reconciliation in terms of those dimensions does not preclude justice. It does not preclude people going to jail. The point is that it's about how you manage that at a societal level. So you might be prosecuting people for human rights violations, which is absolutely correct in certain contexts, but you're trying to build a common vision at the same time, and that's the job of politics and the job of community groups, is to manage that very contradiction. And for me, it's in the first instance about actually recognizing that is the contradiction. That's the contradiction. When the UN says we can build peace and justice at the same time, that's a contradiction. So let's call it a contradiction, and let's try and work with what that actually means at a political level. So I wouldn't want people to misunderstand the notion of reconciliation as something which is about letting people off or just understanding everybody's position and everything is relatively okay. The actual process is managing those 5 things which have different, those 5 strands which have different potential outcomes. And that's a political and a social and a community process, and that's why, to end on my slide, it's a serious business.
Well, thank you very much, Brandon. I think this has been an excellent introduction to our conversation. You have already made a clear point, and I think we would all agree in this room, that reconciliation is not a fluffy thing, sort of a side product of a peace process, but a fundamental one, and probably one of the most difficult and challenging ones. You have suggested a working definition, which some people may want to pick up on when they, throughout the conversations. In the next three blocks, you have highlighted that the agency of reconciliation crosses different levels of society. Interesting, it's not just between divided communities, it is also inside communities when there is political division. Some questions that are already there for us to look into deeper. How do you change political dynamics actually? How can you do reconciliation when the conflict is still ongoing? And it might be a conflict not necessarily with violence, but a political conflict. And that seems to take people in different directions. And at the very end, you've introduced the concept and the relevance of acknowledgement, which is something that might come up in our conversations, and at the same time, the contradiction of reconciliation and human rights, if at all. Good, so please enjoy the break. And thank you, Brandon.